Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to Global Tea Break. We're having internet problems again today. The internet is off. So I'm having to tether to my phone. So I hope that this is going to work because the router has, well, I don't know, the internet's gone down again. Hooray, hooray, joy. Hello, hello. Welcome, everybody. Thanks for coming. Hope you're all well today. So we're back on Women's Wednesdays today. Actually, let me just pop a little comment so that we know what we're talking about. Women's Wednesdays. And we are talking about Amy Johnson today. Here we go. Just going to pop that up there. Now, really excitingly, I've had my first 2 bookings for virtual tours, which is brilliant. So I'm thrilled. So thank you to those people who have booked and gone and had a look at the website as well and mentioned it to their colleagues and their friends. So I'm really thrilled. Thank you very much. I got my first one on Friday evening. We're doing our first virtual tour. So yay, it's going to be good. Right. Has everyone got a cup of tea? Got my tea here today, my lovely little black and white mug. I went for my run this morning. There were loads of people in the park and not everyone was keeping away from me. So I did a lot of running on the grass today just to kind of get away from everyone walking side by side. Coffee for Katie. Coffee for Katie. Oh, this is not gin, Katie. That's something impressive. It's Katie's birthday tomorrow, so I have to remember to wish her happy birthday tomorrow. Right, well, we're going to start, I think. So we're going to talk today about someone that I really admire. I mean, I realise that I've done that every week on Women's Wednesdays. I pick somebody that I really admire. And I'm sort of steering away from some of the obvious women that, you know, you might think of, queens and that kind of thing, because they get talked about an awful lot. So I'm trying to pick some of the lesser known women. This week is Amy Johnson. Next week I'm going to be doing a talk on Sophia Duleep Singh, who is again another woman that I really, really admire. So that's going to be next week's one. But for now, we're going to start with the fabulous Amy Johnson. I'm going to bring up a picture of her here, looking very glamorous indeed. This is Amy. Now she and I have a very tenuous link in that she was born in Hull, which is where I went to university, so I feel quite proud of that. But she was born in Hull in 1903. And she was born in an age where, you can see there, she's dressed in flying gear, you know, the kind of classic sort of big old glasses and all of that, because she was indeed a pilot, and she was the only pilot, female pilot, well, the first, and I think actually the only, to fly solo from the UK to Australia, but we'll get to that bit later. So growing up, she didn't have any links to aviation at all, above and beyond the fact that she was born into an era that was very, very big in aviation, and things were developing fast. 1917, the Royal Air Force in the UK was founded just towards the end of the First World War, and planes were very sort of, you know, early planes, really. Things, you know, like the kind of the biplanes that you get. Let me show you a little picture of a biplane. Here, this sort of thing that when you think of old planes, that's what you're used to seeing is the kind of the biplane, and that is what was around really when Amy Johnson was growing up. But she didn't have any link to that. Her father was had a sort of fish export business, living in Hull. There's a very big fishing community there, so that's what he did. And she went to university. She moved down to London and got a job as a typist in a solicitor's firm. Very simple, but one weekend, she was a bit bored, had nothing much to do, and she hopped on a random bus which took her out to an aerodrome in North London called Stag Lane Aerodrome. And when she was there, she just absolutely fell in love with the planes. And it was an instant thing for her. And so she spent all of her spare time going up to the airfield to hang out, to look at the planes, and eventually she started to learn to fly. Now, aviation, so this is kind of coming into the 1920s. Aviation is known as the Golden Age of Aviation. This is the period in which huge developments are happening. We're going from the biplanes that you see here to things like the monoplanes, which can go faster, they're lighter, they can go for longer. And so as a result, that people are taking more chances. It's very glamorous. People are doing all sorts of kind of crazy aerobatics and sort of crazy sort of record-breaking distances and times and that kind of thing. So it's, you know, it's an era that's really, really exciting and very glamorous. And along with that, of course, there's a lot of money that you might need to be in the aviation industry. So as a result, it was lots of very high up people, you know, lady this and that, Duchess so-and-so, were all kind of the female aviators at the time. But, you know, you had to have money and often a bit of status, which Amy didn't have. She was a normal girl. And so she really had to kind of graft really hard to get where she was going to go. She started out by getting her engineer's certificate, which is impressive because a lot of these ladies and duchesses didn't do that. They went straight in and flew. But Amy went for the engineers and eventually started taking flying lessons. Her dad helped her out with the cost of that, and she started to learn to fly. And at the age of 26, she got her pilot's license. Now, you know, this was pretty impressive for somebody coming from a fairly, you know, standard background with not much money behind her. And she starts to kind of really get excited in sort of pushing the boundaries a little bit. 1939 is when you know, your more sort of jet powered engines come in, so you get planes that can go further, that can go longer, and Amy decides that actually she's going to attempt something that has only been done once before by a man. In 1928, there was a man called Bert Hinkler who decided, he's an Australian guy, decided he was going to fly from London to Australia, which he did. And he did it in a record-breaking 15 days. Now, this was a solo flight. And Amy thought, well, that sounds pretty good to me. I'm going to have a go at that as well. She managed to amass about £600, which, you know, sounds pretty decent for an aeroplane these days. And she bought an aeroplane called Jason. Now, I'm just going to show you. And actually, I don't know if I've got a picture of Jason here. But I'm going to show you a picture of Amy in her flight gear. I think she looks fantastic. And she looks so kind of controlled and in power of what she's doing. So she buys Jason. And in 1930, 2 years after Bert's done his journey, she sets off. The way that she's decided to do it, now there's a couple of ways you could look to plan a route to Australia, and everything was planned meticulously. What she did is she basically took a ruler, popped it on the map and went, we're going to go straight there, which meant that, you know, it was the shortest distance, but it was much more challenging because she was going over places that were very inhospitable, some that were uncharted. She didn't have any radio access to the ground. You know, this is not flying the way that we know it now. There's no radio access, very little weather reporting, and very, you know, what there was or what she was able to get whilst on journey was, you know, fairly minimal at best. But she had to stick to her route because every place that she was stopping, and here's the little map of where she went, fuel had been arranged for her. So she had to get there in order to refuel. And so this is the route she took. Now, she started off perfectly well, and she got all the way down to where did she get to Iraq, and she had to crash. Well, she didn't crash land, but she landed in the desert in the middle of a dust storm, and it was the fastest record for getting to Iraq via flight that anyone had ever done. So the press suddenly kind of pricked up their ears. Now, when she left, there was a little bit of press attention when she left the UK. The Daily Mail, that bastion of feminist reporting, said that she had departed with a cupboard full of glorious frocks, which I think you can imagine is not true. But anyway, so she gets to Iraq, she lands, she refuels, and then she has a couple of exciting stops en route. She manages to stop in India, and she ends up landing on the parade ground of a garrison of troops, and they had no idea she was coming, and it kind of surprised them. But she hit a bit of a bump when she got to Burma, or what is now Myanmar. She had to land in a monsoon, and as she landed, it was a bit of a bumpy landing. The one of the wings and the propeller took a bit of a hit, and so she was grounded for a little while they had to repair it. Now, the way that they repaired it is so cool. There had been, after the First World War, they'd sort of decommissioned planes, and they'd taken the material that had been used for the planes and they'd made them into shirts and stitched them all together. So they got these shirts back, they unstitched them, and they used that material to patch up the plane, which is just phenomenal. But because of that, because of the monsoon, she had a little bit of a delay. So she didn't end up beating Bert's record. But nonetheless, she arrived in Australia after 19 days, and I'm going to show you a little bit. She was basically a huge celebrity by this point. You know, everybody just loved her. Women were going to the hairdressers and asking for the Amy Johnson wave, the haircut, you know, the kind of Jennifer Aniston of her time. Here's a little bit of the parade of her having arrived in Australia, going through the streets, waving at everybody. And so she was, you know, people were going and asking, they were writing her letters, they were, you know, all sorts of things. There was one letter that got to her that said, it was just addressed, Amy, what flies in England? And this is what she said. Actually, I don't think you can hear her.
Hello, everybody. I seem to have got here at last. It's been a long, long time, but here I am, and jolly glad I am to be here at last. I bring messages from the people of England to the people of Australia, and I shall feel very, very happy if this life of man can bring together people so far apart, but so near together in good feelings, fellowship and friendship and
So there we go. So that's her having arrived in Australia, talking about bringing everybody together through flight. Now, you might notice that is not a Hull accent. I don't know if Dave's watching today, my colleague who is from Hull. That's not a Hull accent. It's very RP at the time. So she gets to Australia, she comes back to London, she is a huge celebrity here. She lands in Croydon, which is where she set off from. My dad's from Croydon, so shout out to my dad. So she arrives in Croydon and she comes back up from Croydon into the centre of London, up to the hotel called the Grosvenor House Hotel, which, guys, we will know very well. And the route, basically London ground to a halt, there were 1 million people apparently lining the route to see her as she came back into London, which is really rather lovely. Now, she then decided, well, you know, I don't really feel I can go back to a normal life. I'm done with that. I like the excitement. So she set off with a guy who was her mentor and an engineer, and he together, it was called Jack Humphreys. They flew as co-pilots and they set records flying to Moscow and to Tokyo as well. Now, when she came back from that, she sort of she met a chap called Jim Mollison. Now, I'm going to show you a little picture of her and Jim together. Here we go. This is her and Jim Mollison on the left. Now, they met when they were flying together. He clearly fell instantly in love because they had known each other for 8 hours and they were still in the air when he asked her to marry him, which is rather lovely. And she said yes, and they got married, and it didn't last particularly well. They got married in, I think, 33 and divorced in 38, but they flew together an awful lot. And having got married, she then promptly beat his world record fastest flight to Cape Town. So she wasn't taking, you know, the fact that she got married as any kind of stop to her career. She kept going. They were known as the Flying Sweethearts, which I think is really, really rather lovely. I think I have another picture of... Actually, no, this is a great picture here. This is her arriving in London. Yorkshire's Flying Girl arrives in... I'm not sure where that is, Battersea, I think. So flying in across to the aerodrome. That is a picture of Amy Johnson flying solo. Now... when she's sort of done all those fantastic flights and set loads of records, she sort of, you know, there were lots of flight records being done, and it was becoming harder and harder to make a name. So she thought, actually, I'm just going to sort of bail out there. And she went to become a kind of businesswoman and was also a fashion model for people like Coco Chanel and Elsa Schiaparelli. And so she appeared in loads of fabulous magazines and was always dressed up to the nines. And then in 1939, World War II breaks out. Now, World War II is a very important time for sort of women's rights, really, because, of course, all the men go away to war. The women have to take the roles that the men took, do jobs, all kinds of things. And there's one role in particular that people don't talk about that much. There is an organisation, and it was called the Air Transport Auxiliary, and it was formed in 1939. And what it was a civilian organisation staffed predominantly, not exclusively, but predominantly by women, and their job was to fly aeroplanes around the country from the factories that they'd been created in out to the airfields and the squadrons where they were needed. Now, this means that there were women flying things like Spitfires and bombers single-handedly around the country, and often they would get to where they were in the morning. They would rock up to where they were told to go, and they'd be given an aircraft that they'd never flown before, and they had no clue. They didn't get any training on the instruments in there. They had, you know, minimal maps, and often in very bad weather, and they were just told, fly this to wherever. And there's one lady in particular who I want to show you about, so I'm going to interrupt the story of Amy to show you a picture of Mary Ellis. And Mary Ellis died, I think, 2 years ago. She was in her hundreds. Really fascinating lady. She was a member of this Air Transport Auxiliary. And she said it was really exciting. You'd turn up and suddenly they'd be like, there's a Spitfire, take that down the road. And she said, you know, we're supposed to fly right there. We might have had a little bit of fun en route. And it was a very dangerous job. You know, you're flying solo in aircraft you haven't trained on. And so there were quite a lot of losses of life. But people don't ever really talk about the women flying these planes. Now, there's a great quote. There's actually a brilliant podcast by Dan Snow, the history guy, on Mary Ellis, which I recommend you listen to. It was one of the best podcasts I've ever listened to, that one. And he released it just shortly after she died, and he'd done an interview with her, I think 6 months prior or something. And these women that were flying everywhere were known rather reductively as the beauty chorus, because, you know, women arriving in planes. And Mary Ellis, one day, she was fairly slight. In fact, I'm going to show you a little picture of her here with one of her friends with a plane in the background. She arrived at this airfield in, I think it was a bomber, and she hopped down and she had a parachute on and she went up and said, right, I have this chit, I have to get this chit signed to hand it over. Can we go and do that? And they said, no, we can't do that. We're waiting for the pilot to get down. And she said, I am the pilot. And they didn't believe her. And they actually went up the steps into the cockpit of the plane to go and check for the pilot. And of course, there was no pilot there. It was Mary Ellis. But she, I mean, the way she tells it is absolutely brilliant. And when she was 100, this is her at 100, she went back up in a Spitfire. And when Dan Snow interviewed her, she was 100 and something. She didn't actually disclose how old she was. He said, when was the last time you flew solo? She said about 2 years ago. So it might well have been this occasion that she flew in a Spitfire. I don't know if she was flying in that picture right there. Mum and Dad have just said Lancaster. Oh, she was in a Lancaster bomber. Okay, well, there we go. Fantastic. Thank you. Amy Johnson decides that she's going to sign up. In fact, here is... no, where are we? Pop it back to Amy Johnson somewhere. In fact, what I'm going to do is just put this up of her flying while I'm telling you this next bit. So, Amy decides to join up, and she joins up in 1940 to the Air Transport Auxiliary. And she's flying for them. And then one night, in the 5th of January, 1941, her plane crashes in the Thames estuary. Now, this is where the mystery starts. We don't really know too much about what happened. The aircraft was miles off route, flying in very bad weather, and there was no explanation that's ever been discovered as to why she crashed, and also her body was never found. There were some of her possessions. There was a travel bag, a logbook, and I think a checkbook or something that were washed up and were found, and there was apparently a ship nearby that reportedly one of the guys on the ship reported seeing something that he thought was a body in the water. He jumped in to go and get the body, didn't manage to do it. He was pulled back onto ship and he actually died later of exposure and shock. So nothing was ever recovered in that second body, if there was one there at all, or it could have been weeds, who knows, was never recovered either. There's been all sorts of speculation about what happened to her. There were rumours that she was on a secret mission, which is why she was off route. There's no evidence come to light for that. There's a very mundane theory that she, got lost and ran out of fuel. I mean, this is Amy Johnson. It would be very tricky, but then again, it was really bad weather that night. Someone did come forward to say that he believed that he might have shot her down by accident. What would happen is all of the pilots flying around the UK would be given a daily code, and when you were radioed in, if you didn't give the code correctly, they would assume that you were a foreign aircraft and they would shoot you down. And he says that he thought he may now have shot down Amy Johnson for failing to give the correct code or give a code at all. We don't know whether or not that's true, but nothing has ever been found of Amy Johnson. And of course, there is no grave for her because her body was never found. So there was a few weeks later, there was at St Martin's in the Field, which is a church on Trafalgar Square, there was a memorial for her. But other than that, the only thing really that remains from Amy Johnson is this wonderful statue in Hull, which is where she's from. This glorious one of her striding out towards the aircraft that she so loved to fly. So there we go, and I'm going to leave it on that one for the last little bit. So that is the story of Amy Johnson, another pioneer woman, not just pioneering for women, but also for women pilots. And of course now, the RAF has a huge amount of female pilots, and she very much sort of paved the way for that. So that is the end of our little chat on Amy Johnson. I realise I haven't given you a menu for what's coming up the next few days, but tomorrow we're going to have a talk from one of my colleagues, Viv, on some of the private collection of the Queen's jewels, which is going to be amazing. And my colleague Russell, I don't know if he's watching today, but he is doing a great talk at 4 o'clock today over on Guide London on Facebook. Russell is an expert on George IV and all things kind of kingly fashion. So that is what he's going to be doing at 4 o'clock. Don't miss it. It's going to be a cracker. And I will be back tomorrow at 3 o'clock with the lovely Viv. I don't think there's anything else I need to tell you. No, that's it for today. Have a wonderful afternoon. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you tomorrow. Bye.